You imagine the fog of a London morning in 1854. The air hangs thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and the distant tang of horse manure on cobblestone streets. Inside a modest terraced house in Whitechapel, a mother stirs a teaspoon of dark amber liquid into her cup of weak tea. The liquid is laudanum tincture of opium, mixed with alcohol, bitter and potent. It is a medicine, a comfort, and, quietly, an escape. She is one of many. Across the narrow streets of Victorian England, in parlours and kitchens, in the drawing rooms of the wealthy and the cramped dwellings of the poor, women were consuming laudanum by the drop, by the spoonful, and by the ounce. It was prescribed for almost everything: nervousness, sleeplessness, colic, menstrual pain, hysteria, grief. It was sold freely in apothecaries, advertised in newspapers, and endorsed by doctors who assured their patients that it was a safe and gentle remedy. But it was not gentle. Laudanum's main ingredient, opium, came from the milky sap of the poppy. When refined, it carried morphine, the same chemical that, a century later, would fuel global addiction crises. In Victorian England, however, addiction was not a public scandal. It was a private shame, tucked behind lace curtains and polite smiles. The story of morphine and misery in Victorian England is not one of criminals or rebels. It is one of mothers, ordinary, exhausted, respectable mothers, who found themselves trapped between the crushing expectations of propriety and the easy relief of a bottle that promised peace. By the 1840 seconds, laudanum was everywhere. It was as common as tea. Every household medicine chest held a small brown bottle labelled Tinct OP, often with a skull and crossbones, faintly etched on the label. The dosage was simple: a few drops for an infant's cough, a teaspoon for a mother's nerves, a spoonful more for sleeplessness. The bitter taste could be masked with sugar or sherry. Apothecaries sold it without question. Some even mixed their own varieties, combining it with camphor or saffron for enhanced effects. The problem was not only availability, but ignorance. The word addiction was not yet part of medical vocabulary. Physicians spoke instead of habitual use or dependence, and even then, with hesitation. Most did not recognize the full danger of opium consumption, especially among women. Female patients were considered delicate, emotional, and in constant need of moral and physical soothing. The culture of the time rewarded quiet endurance, not confrontation with pain, so women endured, and laudanum helped them do it. It dulled the ache of endless childbearing, and the fatigue of raising children without rest. It softened grief after stillbirths, which were common. It calmed the tremors of anxiety in a world where women had little control over their bodies, finances, or futures. And when taken regularly, it numbed everything: pain, joy, hunger, and will. One medical journal from 1868 estimated that a considerable portion of the female middle class in England was habitually consuming opiates. Another report, from the Lancet, suggested that entire communities in northern mill towns were tinged with the peculiar lassitude of laudanum. These were not the opium dens of penny dreadfuls and dockside nightmares. These were parlours and nurseries, quiet places where mothers fed their babies and sipped their medicine from dainty cups. There was an economy behind this quiet epidemic. The British Empire's trade networks carried the seeds of addiction across continents. Poppies were cultivated in Bengal under the watchful eyes of the East India Company, processed into opium and exported to China and to England. The profits funded railways, wars, and aristocratic estates. By the time laudanum reached the domestic market, it was cheap, refined, and deceptively respectable. Pharmaceutical catalogues listed dozens of preparations. Godfrey's cordial was marketed for soothing infants. Mother Bailey's quieting syrup promised restful nights for mother and child alike. Dover's powder, a mix of opium and ipecacuanha, was prescribed for colds. None came with a warning label. Women trusted the medical establishment. They had little choice not to. A doctor's word carried authority, and most doctors were men, educated, confident, and rarely questioned. They prescribed laudanum liberally, believing that moderate use was harmless. The distinction between medicine and poison blurred under the weight of social hierarchy and ignorance. By the time withdrawal symptoms appeared, insomnia, tremors, nausea, melancholy, they were dismissed as signs of female weakness or nervous disorders. The cure, naturally, was more laudanum. Consider the case of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the celebrated poet. She began using laudanum as a teenager to treat spinal pain and lung weakness. For years, she relied on it daily, describing herself as subdued to opium. Her dependence shaped her, writing slow, introspective, melancholy. She was one of the fortunate ones. Her fame and wealth afforded her careful management and medical supervision. Countless other women, nameless and poor, sank quietly into dependence. Norman Kerr wrote in 1888 of a woman from Lancashire who began taking laudanum to ease menstrual cramps. Within 2 years, she could not go a day without it. Her family noticed her irritability and her pallor, but assumed she was ailing. When her bottle ran dry, she grew hysterical and fainted. Her physician refilled her prescription. She died within the year. Heart and liver collapsed under chemical strain. But her story was not unusual. It was unremarkable. In homes like hers, the domestic world was both comfort and cage. Women were expected to maintain perfect composure. They managed households, raised children, obeyed husbands, and suppressed emotion. There was no vocabulary for mental health, no outlet for despair. A bottle of laudanum became both medicine and rebellion, a small act of control over one's body and mind. When the children cried too loudly, a few drops in their milk could quiet them. When the husband's temper flared, a spoonful could steady trembling hands. When the nights grew long with worry, another sip could send a mother into heavy sleep. And so, an invisible cycle began, women pacifying themselves, pacifying their children, pacifying a society that demanded silence from them all. The poppy became the silent witness to their suffering. By the 1870 seconds, a subtle shift began. Medical journals started to question the morality of habitual opium use. The term morphinism appeared in print, referring to patients dependent on morphine injections, a newer, stronger derivative of opium. But among women, the older habit of laudanum drinking persisted quietly. Pharmacies continued to sell it over the counter. Clergymen, doctors, and reformers occasionally warned against its dangers, but few laws restricted it. The danger lay in its invisibility. Alcoholism could be seen, smelled, and condemned. Opium use, especially in tincture form, left few outward signs. Its victims remained respectable, their decline masked by privacy and propriety. A housewife could waste away in her bedroom for years, her skin pale, her movements slow, her mind dull from years of dosing, and the neighbors would say only that she was delicate. Even as science advanced, the social understanding of addiction lagged behind. The emerging field of psychiatry in the late 19th century began to study nervous disorders, but largely ignored the chemical dependencies that underpinned them. The idea that a woman could become enslaved to a drug, not by moral failure but by circumstance and ignorance, was too uncomfortable for polite society to admit. And so the bottles stayed on the shelves. Mothers continued to sip from them. Children continued to be fed soothing syrups and cordials, their small bodies absorbing traces of the same drug that numbed their mothers. In this quiet, domestic tragedy, there is something profoundly human. It is not the story of villains and victims, but of endurance and misunderstanding. The mothers of Victorian England did not seek intoxication. They sought relief from pain, from sorrow, from the weight of expectation. The irony is that their search for comfort brought them closer to despair. As the century turned and new medicines appeared, laudanum's reign slowly faded, yet its legacy lingered in hidden graves, in forgotten bottles, in the fragile line between healing and harm. And so, as we look back on those narrow streets and dimly lit parlours, one cannot help but wonder, when you imagine the heart of the British Empire, in the mid-19th century, you might think of grand ships in harbour, tea chests, silk, and crates of spices stacked along the docks. But alongside these symbols of commerce was another, less celebrated cargo: opium. The same drug that soothed the nerves of English mothers came from fields thousands of miles away, in Bengal and Malwa, where the poppy was cultivated under the hot Indian sun. To understand how Victorian England became quietly addicted, you must follow the trail of this flower, not through the drawing rooms of London, but through the warehouses of Calcutta and the battlefields of China. Because behind every English teacup laced with laudanum was an empire built on pain. In 1839, 2 decades before the height of laudanum's domestic popularity, Britain had already gone to war over opium. The First Opium War began when China, desperate to stop the influx of the drug, confiscated and destroyed British opium stores in Canton. In response, British gunboats shelled Chinese ports. The conflict was not about medicine, it was about profit. The East India Company had for decades grown opium in India and smuggled it into China to trade for silver, which Britain needed to buy Chinese tea. When the Chinese government tried to ban the drug, Britain defended its right to trade it at cannon point. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, forced China to pay reparations, open its ports, and cede Hong Kong. It was, in simple terms, a victory for the drug trade. And while Britain's statesmen celebrated new trade routes, a quiet irony unfolded at home. The very nation exporting addiction abroad was nursing its own within its households. The same ships that carried opium to China brought back refined tinctures to England. The drug that was a weapon of empire abroad became a medicine of domestic comfort at home. By 1850, the British opium economy was thriving. The East India Company's monopoly ensured that nearly every ounce of the drug was accounted for, taxed, and traded. In India, farmers were compelled sometimes by debt, sometimes by law, to cultivate poppies instead of food crops. Inspectors travelled from village to village, measuring fields and collecting sap. The raw opium was processed in massive government factories, shaped into balls, packed in chests, and shipped by the ton. For the Indian farmer, opium was survival. For the company official, it was fortune. For the English mother, it was medicine. Each believed they were merely doing what they must to endure. The global web of dependency was intricate and cruel. A Bengali farmer bent over a poppy field did not know his labour would end in the quiet despair of a mother in Leeds. A doctor in London, writing tinct, opii, on a prescription slip, did not see the famine spreading through Indian provinces where food had been replaced by poppies. The suffering was divided by class, race, and ocean, but it was bound by the same flower. Laudanum itself was the product of this vast machinery. The recipe was simple: 1 part opium dissolved in 10 parts alcohol. It could be made cheaply and sold in small quantities. By the 1862, it was a household staple across Britain's social classes. The poor could buy it by the penny from apothecaries. The rich ordered it in crystal bottles, labelled with Latin phrases that lent an air of refinement. It treated everything from toothaches to heartbreak. But its widespread use revealed more than just medical ignorance. It exposed the brittleness of Victorian society. For all its industrial triumphs and moral pretensions, England was a nation living in quiet pain. Poverty was endemic, child mortality high, and mental illness misunderstood. The empire's progress was built on exhaustion, and exhaustion required relief. It's important to imagine how the drug's presence reshaped the rhythm of daily life. In the textile towns of the north, factory workers often lived in constant pain, aching joints, coughs from cotton dust, and the ceaseless fatigue of long shifts. Mothers used laudanum not only for their nerves, but to quiet their hungry children. A few drops in a baby's bottle could bring hours of silence in crowded, shared tenements. In some communities, local grocers even sold laudanum alongside tea and sugar. It became part of domestic routine, an invisible staple of survival. An 1,872 medical report from Manchester revealed that some families spent more on laudanum than on bread. Doctors began to notice that children under 5 were dying in unusual numbers. Not from disease, but from overdose. Inquests often recorded the deaths as accidental. Few parents were ever blamed. Fewer still understood what they had done. Meanwhile, among the middle and upper classes, the drug carried a different kind of burden. Respectable women, often confined to narrow roles of wife and mother, used laudanum to suppress the emotions that society forbade them to express. Doctors diagnosed them with nervous exhaustion, melancholia, or hysteria. Melancholia, and prescribed tinctures liberally. A woman who expressed discontent was seen as fragile, not oppressed. The bottle beside her bed symbolized both her obedience and her despair. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who famously wrote Kubla Khan under the influence of opium, once described his dependence as a vicious slavery. Yet when women suffered similar symptoms, withdrawal, trembling, hallucinations, they were described as delicate. Their addiction was romanticized as an ailment of the sensitive and refined. Even Queen Victoria's own physician, Sir John Snow, famous for discovering the source of cholera, was known to prescribe opiates for menstrual pain and childbirth. There is no record of whether the Queen herself used laudanum, but her journals make frequent mention of nervous attacks and the need for strong medicine. What is striking is not the existence of addiction, but the absence of recognition. There were no rehabilitation clinics, no public warnings, no moral crusades like those against alcohol. Addiction to opiates was hidden behind the facade of gentility. When reformers finally began to speak of it, they did so hesitantly. In 1877, Dr. J.B. Mattison published a paper titled The Opium Habit and Its Treatment. He described dozens of cases, most of them women, who had become dependent after years of prescribed use. Yet even he framed their addiction as a disease of nervous temperament, not as a systemic failure of medicine or empire. The British public, so proud of its moral superiority in the age of empire, could not admit that it was addicted to its own trade. The hypocrisy deepened when Britain began its second war with China in 1856, the Second Opium War. This time, the justification was even thinner. British merchants demanded open access to Chinese markets for opium and other goods. Once again, warships were dispatched, cities bombarded, and treaties rewritten at gunpoint. While English newspapers celebrated victory, English mothers continued to pour their own measure of the empire's poison into their cups. The global and the personal mirrored each other perfectly. Both systems built on dependence, both sustained by denial. The late 19th century brought the beginnings of reform, though slowly and unevenly. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was the first British law to regulate the sale of poisons, including opium, but it only required that opiates be sold by registered pharmacists, not that customers provide a prescription. In practice, anyone with a few pennies and a reason could still buy a bottle. Public awareness grew gradually. Articles in the Times began to question the morality of the drug trade. Missionaries returning from China told stories of entire villages destroyed by addiction. Medical societies debated whether habitual use was moral weakness or medical malpractice. But the changes were too late for a generation of women who had already built their lives around the comfort of laudanum. There were attempts to quit, of course. Diaries from the period tell of desperate self-treatment, gradual reduction, herbal substitutes, confinement. Some women turned to alcohol to dull the symptoms of withdrawal, which included chills, vomiting, and hallucinations. Others wrote letters to doctors begging for help, only to receive more opium under another name. A letter from 1883, written by an anonymous woman to the British Medical Journal, reads, "Sir, I have for 12 years taken laudanum in small quantities, prescribed first for pain of the head. I have long wished to cease, but find myself unable. I am a mother of 4, and fear my children will think me mad if I abstain. Pray, is there any cure for such a bondage?" The journal published her letter, but not the reply if one ever came. By the turn of the century, new synthetic drugs began to appear: cocaine, heroin, chloral hydrate, marketed as safe alternatives to opium. And cycle of dependence simply evolved. But laudanum's reign left deep marks on English society. It changed how medicine was practiced, how pain was perceived, and how women's suffering was dismissed. Even the language of addiction shifted. What had once been a female malady became a medical condition, though still laden with stigma. In many ways, the modern understanding of dependency began in these quiet Victorian parlours, among women who never meant to become patients of history. If you walk today through London's older neighbourhoods, Bloomsbury, Whitechapel, or Manchester's mill quarters, you might pass the remains of old apothecaries. Some have plaques, others have been turned into cafes or shops. But beneath their polished windows and modern facades lies the memory of a trade that built an empire and broke countless lives. The laudanum bottle was a mirror reflecting both the empire's pride and its despair. And as Britain's ships carried opium across oceans and its doctors prescribed it across class lines, one question began to whisper beneath the noise of progress. Was the empire addicted not only to the drug, but to the illusion of control it promised? By the closing decades of the 19th century, the British Empire stood at the height of its global power. Railways spanned continents, telegraph cables stitched the seas, and industry hummed in 1,000 towns. But beneath the grandeur of progress, the quiet pulse of addiction still beat in English homes. The mothers who had once found solace in their laudanum bottles were growing older. Some had weaned themselves off, others could not. Their daughters, too, had learned the taste of it, if not through direct use, then through the example of a generation that had treated opium as an ordinary companion. Yet, as science advanced and moral reform gathered strength, a reckoning began. The empire had built its wealth upon poppies, but now the flower was turning against it. By 1890, medical journals were filled with case studies of morphinism and opium habitués. For the first time, addiction was discussed as a social and physiological condition rather than a moral failure. Hospitals began to establish small wards for treatment, often run by religious charities or pioneering physicians. The treatments, however, were brutal. Withdrawal was poorly understood, and patients were sometimes confined, deprived of the drug entirely, and left to suffer the symptoms: convulsions, vomiting, hallucinations, chills. Some died in agony. Others were given alcohol or chloroform to ease their suffering, which only deepened dependence. Still, the conversation was shifting. In 1898, the German pharmaceutical company Bayer introduced a new drug, heroin, advertised as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. Doctors embraced it with tragic enthusiasm. They prescribed it freely, unaware that it was chemically near identical to morphine, only faster acting. The cycle continued, only under a different name. It would take decades for medicine to recognize that the dream of a painless cure was itself the sickness. But for most Victorian women, the question was not of science, but of survival. Imagine again the interior of a modest home in 1892. The wallpaper is faded, The air smells faintly of coal dust and soap. A mother sits by a window, her hands trembling slightly as she pours a measured spoonful of laudanum into a teacup. She tells herself it is the last time. She has said it before. Her husband works in the shipyards. Her oldest son has left for the army. Her youngest coughs through the night. She remembers when a doctor first gave her the tincture. 20 years ago, after her second miscarriage, he told her it would calm her nerves. It did. It still does. Outside, a reformer's pamphlet warns of the curse of the poppy, but she cannot read it. Her eyes blur, her hands shake. The bottle is her anchor. For her, the addiction is not a vice. It is memory. It is routine. It is the thread that connects her to all the other women who suffered quietly, under the weight of expectation and endurance. The Victorian press began to take notice. In 1893, the Pall Mall Gazette published an exposé titled "Our Opium-Eating Women." The tone was half pity, half scorn. It described respectable ladies of refined bearing who lived in a haze of gentle intoxication. The article shocked readers, not because it revealed a crime, but because it unveiled something profoundly ordinary. For the first time, the nation's secret dependence became public knowledge. The figure of the opium-eating mother entered the cultural imagination, an emblem of both weakness and tragedy. Writers and poets took note. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published earlier in 1821, found new readers, though his elegant prose masked the horror of addiction with literary mystique. Later, authors like Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens wove opium into their fiction. Collins's The Moonstone famously centered on a crime committed under its influence. But while literature transformed addiction into metaphor, real mothers continued to live its consequences in silence. The medical establishment, too, began to reckon with its complicity. The same doctors who had once prescribed laudanum for every ailment now distanced themselves from it. By 1900, opium-based medicines were quietly vanishing from pharmacy shelves, replaced by newer synthetics and stronger regulations. The Pharmacy Act of 1908 finally restricted opium sales to prescriptions only. It was the beginning of modern drug control. But enforcement was inconsistent, especially in rural areas where apothecaries still served as community doctors. Some women continued to purchase their tinctures discreetly, relying on old relationships and whispered transactions. Addiction does not end when a law changes. It tensor, lingers in the body, in the mind, in the habits of a people. Withdrawal was not merely physical, it was cultural. For generations, laudanum had been a symbol of comfort, a mother's private medicine. Its disappearance left a void not easily filled. In its place came other tonics and remedies: bromides for sleep, chloral hydrate for anxiety, alcohol for loneliness. The names changed, but the desire remained the longing to soften life's edges, to escape, however briefly, from the weight of endurance. The mothers who survived the transition often did so quietly, without recognition. There were no monuments to their suffering, no memorials for their lost years. History moved on, celebrating progress and science, forgetting the quiet epidemic that had once touched every class and corner of the nation. Yet, traces of it remain, hidden in archives and family records. In the 1970 seconds, historians examining Victorian death certificates found a curious pattern. Many women listed as dying of heart failure or dropsy had symptoms consistent with long-term opium poisoning. In coroner's reports, the phrase "died suddenly" appeared again and again, masking what doctors could not or would not name. One report from 1879, preserved in the Lancashire archives, records the death of Mrs. A, aged 47, mother of 5, found deceased in bed, bottle of laudanum half empty. The inquest concluded simply, self-administered in error. It was neither murder nor suicide, but something in between a slow, misunderstood surrender. By the early 20th century, the culture that had birthed the laudanum epidemic was fading. Women's roles were changing. Suffrage movements were rising. New conversations about health, mental illness, and bodily autonomy were beginning. The era of silent suffering was ending, though its echoes would last. In a way, the story of the addicted mothers of Victorian England is not merely about a drug, it is about control. Opium soothed the pain of women who were denied agency over their lives, their bodies, and their choices. It offered a temporary illusion of freedom within the narrow confines of social expectation. When the empire finally acknowledged the poison in its medicine, it was forced to confront a deeper truth, that its moral order had depended on keeping women quiet, compliant, and sedated. Today, when we look back, it is easy to judge. We see addiction as a crisis of health, a failure of knowledge. But in the candlelit rooms of 19th century England, it was something far more complicated, an act of endurance. Those mothers did not seek oblivion. They sought relief. They sought silence in a world that would not listen. The laudanum bottle on the nightstand was both their torment and their salvation, a small glass witness to a century of exhaustion. The legacy of the Victorian opium era lives on, not just in history books, but in the language of modern medicine. The morphine in hospitals, the painkillers prescribed in millions, the ongoing struggle between relief and dependence, all trace their lineage back to that amber tincture in a teacup. The story of laudanum is not merely one of addiction. It is one of empathy, misunderstood, of pain, medicalized, but never truly seen. And as the empire that profited from poppies crumbled into the 20th century, one quiet truth remained, unspoken but enduring, that in the pursuit of progress, the world's most powerful nation had learned to soothe its conscience the same way its mothers had one drop of opium at a time. You are sitting in the cramped surgery of a Victorian doctor. The year is 1863. The air smells of carbolic acid and dust. The room is lined with glass jars labelled in Latin, tinctura, opii, camphora, pulv, doveri. On the doctor's desk sits a brass balance scale, a row of quills, and a half-drained bottle of port. The man himself, bearded, exhausted, and well-meaning, writes another prescription, his pen scratching out words that will shape a woman's life forever. Take 10 drops in water every evening, he writes, to soothe the nerves and steady the sleep. It is a simple, familiar instruction. He does not think of the consequences, for in his mind, there are none. The drug is common, respectable, and indispensable. It is called laudanum, and in the hands of men like him, it became both salvation and ruin. To understand how the women of Victorian England became addicted to morphine and laudanum, you must first understand the minds of the men who prescribed it. The doctors of the 19th century stood at a peculiar crossroads between medieval superstition and modern science. They had abandoned leeches and bleeding, but had not yet embraced psychology or addiction medicine. Pain, to them, was not something to understand, it was something to silence. And opium was very good at silence. When Thomas Sydenham, a respected 17th century physician, called laudanum among the most valuable medicines we possess, he set a precedent that echoed for centuries. Opium was considered a wonder drug, versatile, effective, and safe in the right hands. By the 1800s, it was a cornerstone of medical practice. Every doctor carried it, every chemist sold it, and every patient trusted it. Yet few understood how it worked. Fewer still cared. Medicine in the 19th century was as much art as science. Without antibiotics, antiseptics, or reliable anesthesia, pain relief was one of the few tools a doctor could offer. A bottle of opium tincture could calm a fever, ease childbirth, suppress a cough, or still a troubled mind. It could, in short, make a physician appear powerful. There was prestige in prescribing opium. The doctor's authority depended on his ability to alleviate suffering. When a patient left his surgery with her nerves soothed and her gratitude overflowing, he believed he had done his duty. But the Victorian physician also operated within a social hierarchy that demanded obedience rather than dialogue. The patient, especially if she was a woman, was expected to accept his judgment without question. A middle-class woman suffering from nervous complaints might receive a bottle of laudanum, a prescription for rest, and advice to avoid mental agitation. Her pain was not studied, it was pacified. The language of medicine disguised the moral assumptions beneath it. Hysteria, for example, was a diagnosis reserved almost exclusively for women, derived from the Greek hystera, the womb. Doctors believed that female emotional instability originated in the reproductive organs. Symptoms ranged from fatigue and insomnia to sadness, anxiety, or anger. The treatment was simple: quiet the body, quiet the mind, and return the patient to docility. Laudanum became the perfect tool for this. It provided instant compliance. The doctors who prescribed it were not malicious. They were products of their time, educated in anatomy, ignorant of psychology, and deeply influenced by Victorian morality. The male body was considered rational, disciplined, and active. The female body, fragile, emotional, and passive. When a man suffered, his pain was treated as injury. When a woman suffered, hers was treated as weakness. This gendered view of medicine created a cycle of dependence. Women were given drugs to suppress the symptoms of their restricted lives, while men, as physicians and husbands, maintained the illusion of control. The irony is that doctors often became addicts themselves. Morphine injections, first introduced in the 1850 seconds, were hailed as a breakthrough, a way to deliver opium's benefits without its unpleasant digestive side effects. Physicians used it on their patients and on themselves. It was common for doctors to carry syringes in their waistcoats, pricking their arms before long surgeries or sleepless nights. By the 1870 seconds, medical journals were quietly acknowledging the problem of morphine habituation among practitioners. One doctor, Dr. Edward Levenstein of Berlin, warned that the physician, familiar with the drug, is its easiest victim. Yet, his warning went largely unheeded. Addiction among doctors remained a private shame, not a public issue. The tension between moral authority and medical ignorance came to define Victorian medicine. The physician saw himself as a moral guide as much as a healer. To relieve suffering was to preserve social order. Pain was viewed as a test of virtue, relief as a gift from science and faith combined. But what happens when relief becomes dependence? When the medicine that restores order quietly undermines it? By mid-century, the question began to haunt the medical establishment. Reports of laudanum habits surfaced in medical journals. The Lancet published cautious warnings about the injudicious use of opiates among females of delicate constitution. Doctors debated whether addiction was a disease or a vice. Most settled on a compromise: it was both. And by framing it as moral weakness rather than medical misjudgment, they absolved themselves of responsibility. The economics of medicine also encouraged the cycle. Doctors in private practice relied on reputation and loyalty. A patient who left dissatisfied might never return. The expectation was simple: you paid for relief. So doctors prescribed what worked quickly and reliably. Opium relieved everything from migraines to melancholia. It created loyal patients, and loyal patients meant stable income. Pharmacists, too, played their part. Compounding medicines was an art form. Many apothecaries prided themselves on their secret formulas, which often contained high doses of opium, soothing syrups, sleeping draughts, and nervine tonics lined their shelves. Each claimed to be safer or purer than the last. None were. Occasionally, a voice of dissent broke through the complacency. Dr. Thomas Wackley, the fiery editor of The Lancet, warned in 1849 that the indiscriminate use of opium in female disorders is a national danger. His words were ignored. He was accused of alarmism. Decades later, reformers like Dr. Norman Kerr and Dr. Henry Jekyll, the real physician, not Stevenson's fictional one, began writing about addiction as a medical condition. They described withdrawal symptoms, tolerance, and the mental anguish of patients who could not stop using the drug. They advocated for compassion rather than condemnation, but their understanding remained limited. Addiction treatment, when attempted, often involved abrupt withdrawal, isolation, and spiritual guidance. Few patients survived it without relapse. The doctor's dilemma persisted. How to heal without harming? How to relieve pain without breeding dependence? There is something almost tragic in the image of those early physicians, earnest men in frock coats, moving between sickbeds with bottles of tincture and hope, believed themselves on the frontier of modern medicine, wielding the power of chemistry against suffering. But they were blind to the human cost of their prescriptions. They saw only symptoms, not stories. They measured dosages, not despair. For the working-class mother who needed to quiet her crying child, for the widow who couldn't sleep through grief, for the housewife living in silent depression, opium was not just medicine. It was her doctor's empathy, poured into liquid form. And that, perhaps, was its greatest danger. It made the physician indispensable, while making the patient invisible. By the 1,880 seconds, a few doctors began to recognize that something had gone terribly wrong. The medical journals no longer spoke of nervous ladies, but of opium habitués. The cases multiplied. Patients wrote letters pleading for help, confessing shame, begging for a cure. The medical profession began to turn inward, realizing that their authority had been built partly on a lie, that the medicine they prescribed to heal had enslaved those they meant to protect. Still, even as awareness grew, denial lingered. Victorian society valued appearances above truth. Doctors feared scandal, families feared gossip. Women who admitted their addiction were often sent to asylums rather than treated. Thus, the silence continued. You can imagine a doctor late at night, staring at the flickering flame of a gas lamp. On his desk lies a half-written paper on female nervous disorders. He dips his pen in ink, hesitates, and instead reaches for the small vial in his drawer. He draws a few drops into a glass of water, drinks, and feels the familiar warmth spread through his chest. He tells himself it is for his insomnia, for his nerves, for the burden of care. In the quiet, he wonders whether he, too, has become what his patients are dependent, not on the drug itself, but on the illusion that he can control it. By the end of the century, the medical establishment began to reckon with its role in the epidemic it had created. The rise of public health movements, the professionalization of pharmacology, and the slow emergence of addiction science began to shift attitudes. But the damage was done. Generations of women and men had lived and died under the care of doctors who mistook suppression for healing. And as the age of empire marched onward, a new question began to emerge within the medical journals and moral societies of Britain. If a nation's physicians could not see the suffering they caused, what hope was there for the empire itself, built on the same mixture of confidence, ignorance, and denial? You step through the creaking wooden door of a Victorian pharmacy. The air smells faintly of sweet syrup and ammonia. Shelves line the walls, stacked with glass bottles and labelled drawers, pulv, opie, chlorodyne, spiritus, ammonia, elixir of life. Each one promises relief, and each one conceals a quiet dependence waiting to be born. Behind the counter stands the chemist, a man in a stiff collar and apron, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight as he measures, pours, and stirs. He is not quite a doctor, yet not merely a tradesman. In his hands lies the power to soothe the empire's nerves. It is the 1,000, 870 seconds, and the British pharmacy is booming. The age of the pharmacist was, in many ways, the age of unregulated medicine. The chemist was both healer and merchant, scientist and salesman. His shop was a miniature empire of bottles and powders, a place where sickness met commerce. And like most empires, it thrived on dependence. Victorian England was addicted to relief. Painkillers were sold freely, often without prescription. A customer might walk in complaining of a cough, a sleepless night, or a restless infant. The chemist would nod sympathetically, reach for a small bottle, and measure out a viscous brown liquid. "Just a teaspoon in warm water," he would say. "It'll calm the nerves." Few asked what was inside. The label might read, "Soothing syrup, infant's quietness, chlorodyne, or Godfrey's cordial." The ingredients were largely the same: opium, morphine, chloroform, and alcohol, disguised beneath names that sounded almost benevolent. By the middle of the century, these concoctions had found their way into nearly every British household. Mothers used them to silence crying babies. Labourers used them to dull the ache of factory life, and the elderly used them to ease their twilight years. Addiction was not a word in common circulation. It was simply called habit. The chemistry of comfort was a thriving business. The Victorians had an almost religious faith in science, and the chemist was its local prophet. His tools, balances, mortars, glass pipettes, symbolized precision and progress. Advertisements in newspapers and magazines proclaimed the miracles of these new medicines. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, for teething, children, Batley's sedative solution, a cure for nervousness and sleeplessness, Collis Brown's chlorodyne, the greatest remedy known to man. Each advertisement featured glowing testimonials. "My baby now sleeps through the night. My husband's cough is cured. No more nerves, no more pain." And yet, beneath the public enthusiasm, a quieter suffering spread. By the 1,880 seconds, Britain was consuming more opium per capita than any other nation on earth. The demand came from every social class. In the slums of London and Manchester, opium was sold by the pennyworth in corner shops. In drawing rooms and seaside resorts, it came in elegantly labelled bottles. Chemists competed for customers with ever stronger formulas. The goal was not safety, but satisfaction. A remedy that calmed instantly sold better than one that took time. Regulation was minimal. The 1852 Pharmacy Act had granted the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain limited authority, but enforcement was weak. Anyone could open a chemist's shop and sell patent medicines without disclosing their ingredients. The law required labelling poisons like arsenic and strychnine, but not opium. The result was a nation lulled by potions it did not understand. In the industrial towns of northern England, mothers became some of the most frequent customers. Factory work was relentless. Poverty left little room for rest or childcare. When a child cried, opium provided quiet. When exhaustion struck, it gave energy, or the illusion of it. An 1879 report from the British Medical Journal warned that infantile mortality is greatly increased in districts where Godfrey's cordial is freely sold. The syrup, a mixture of treacle, water, and laudanum, was killing babies slowly through overdoses and malnutrition. Their cries faded, not from comfort, but from respiratory failure. Yet the practice persisted. The chemists did not ask questions, and the mothers did not confess guilt. Opium dulled more than physical pain, it numbed the moral anxiety of survival. Middle-class women suffered differently. Their dependence was often wrapped in medical legitimacy. They received prescriptions from family doctors for neuralgia, melancholy, or female complaints. Their laudanum bottles came from respectable pharmacies, not back-alley shops. But addiction does not discriminate between classes. The elegant lady sipping laudanum from a porcelain spoon was no safer than the labourer's wife dosing her baby with syrup. The difference was only one of shame. Respectable addiction was a private matter. Working-class addiction was a public vice. The pharmaceutical trade expanded with industrial precision. Factories in London, Bristol, and Glasgow began producing opium tinctures on a massive scale. The East India Company's poppy fields in Bengal supplied the raw material, processed into morphine and shipped to Europe. British pharmacists refined it further into household remedies. The irony was bitter. The empire that waged moral war on Chinese opium consumption during the Opium Wars profited handsomely from its own domestic dependence. At home, the government taxed imported opium heavily, earning millions in revenue. Abroad, it justified its trade as a civilizing mission. The same poppies that fueled the empire's coffers also fed its people's despair. In the back rooms of pharmacies, young apprentices learned to measure out doses by instinct. There were no standardized spoons or droppers. One chemist's drop might be another's dose. Mistakes were inevitable. Newspaper archives from the 1,860 seconds and 70 seconds contain countless small tragedies buried among the classifieds. A child, aged 2 years, accidentally poisoned by cordial purchased for teething. A young woman, lately in poor health, expired after taking an excess of her accustomed tonic. Each case ended the same way, a coroner's note, that death resulted from misadventure. The business of pain created new social hierarchies. Chemists became local authorities, often more trusted than doctors. They offered cheaper advice, friendlier service, and more immediate relief. A doctor might ask probing questions about your health or home life. A chemist asked only, "What troubles you today?" and handed you a bottle. This was medicine as transaction fast, effective, and impersonal. The moral dimension of healing was fading. Suffering became a commodity. As addiction grew, so did moral panic. Newspapers began publishing stories of female opium eaters, often portrayed as tragic, fallen figures. They were depicted as wasting away in darkened rooms, pale and trembling, unable to care for their children or maintain their homes. These accounts were both sympathetic and judgmental. The women were pitied for their weakness, but blamed for their indulgence. Society could grieve for them without questioning the right system that created them. Pharmacists, meanwhile, defended themselves. "We merely provide what the public demands," they argued. And they were right. Demand was insatiable. By the 1,890 seconds, calls for reform grew louder. The temperance movement, originally focused on alcohol, expanded its moral crusade to include opiates. Activists published pamphlets warning of the poison in the parlor and the curse of the cordials. Reformers demanded labeling laws, restrictions on sales, and medical oversight. Doctors, eager to reclaim authority from chemists, supported regulation, but often for reasons of power, not compassion. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had been a timid first step, finally classifying opium as a poison and limiting its sale to registered chemists. Yet enforcement remained uneven. It would take decades and countless quiet deaths before public awareness caught up with the scale of the problem. For the chemists themselves, the moral question was complex. Many genuinely believed they were serving the public good. Others simply could not afford scruples. In competitive markets, profit dictated conscience. And so, the cycle continued. Patients demanded relief. Chemists supplied it, and both pretended not to see the growing dependency that bound them together. The machinery of misery was not fueled by evil intent, but by ordinary needs, comfort, survival, livelihood. It was a system that turned pain into profit and empathy into enterprise. Late one night, a chemist locks up his shop. The gaslight flickers against rows of bottles, amber, green, and clear. He counts the day's earnings, then pauses, his eyes falling on a nearly empty bottle labelled Tinctura OPI. He sighs. He has sold 40 such bottles this week alone. Mothers, widows, factory workers, and a school teacher with nervous complaints. He tells himself he is easing their suffering, but as he blows out the lamp, a question lingers. How many of them will be back? Tomorrow, not for healing, but for the silence only he can sell. The pharmacy's shelves gleam like altars in the dim light, each bottle a prayer, each sale a confession, and beyond the shop door, in drawing rooms and tenements alike, the nation sleeps under the same gentle fog, its dreams sweetened by morphine, its conscience soothed by ignorance. It is the turn of the century now, and the haze has begun to lift. The soft hum of laudanum bottles being uncorked still drifts through the streets of London, but a change, slow, reluctant, and uneasy, is taking shape. The same society that once worshipped the tincture bottle is beginning to fear it. Doctors whisper of the morphia habit, as if speaking a curse. Chemists, once proud of their potions, hide behind new labels and careful words. Even Parliament, slowest of all institutions, begins to stir. But for the men and women who have lived for decades under the shadow of the drug, the reckoning comes too late. You are in a narrow room of a charitable hospital. Street Mary's, or perhaps Guy's, one of those great brick sanctuaries of sickness. The walls are plain, the bed sheets are grey. A nurse stands watch beside a woman shaking in her sleep. Her hands twitch. Her lips whisper nonsense between gasps of pain. This is withdrawal. It is not yet understood by science, only feared. Doctors speak of it as nervous collapse, hysterical crisis, or moral failure. The patient, racked by agony and sweat, is denied opium, sometimes bound to the bed for her own safety. They call it treatment. The woman, perhaps once a seamstress, perhaps a doctor's wife, has not taken her laudanum in 3 days. Her body rebels, her muscles cramp, her heart races, her skin crawls, as though insects live beneath it. The nurses do what they can: cold compresses, prayers, and gentle restraint. She had once called laudanum her comfort. Now it leaves her in pieces. By the late 19th century, the medical profession could no longer ignore what it had created. The word addiction, borrowed from Roman law, where it meant enslavement, entered the medical vocabulary. Doctors began to write cautiously about the condition as a physiological dependence rather than a sin. Norman Kerr's 1888 book Inebriety, its etiology, pathology, treatment, and jurisprudence, was one of the first to treat opium addiction as a disease. He described patients trembling with weakness, haunted by hallucinations, and consumed by despair. He urged compassion over condemnation, yet even Kerr's understanding remained incomplete. He saw addiction as a form of moral disease, something curable by willpower, faith, and seclusion. His treatment centers, though humane by contemporary standards, often enforced cold turkey withdrawal. Patients were isolated, deprived of opiates, and monitored for weeks. Many relapsed immediately upon discharge. Some never left at all. Outside hospital walls, the problem spread quietly. The statistics, when anyone dared count them, were staggering. By 1890, it was estimated that 1 in every 200 Britons regularly consumed opium in some form. In the industrial north, that figure may have been closer to 1 in 50. There were no public campaigns, no awareness posters, no outreach programs. Addiction was not yet a cause. It was a secret. Families hid their suffering, disguising withdrawal as illness and overdose as heart failure. Respectable women were the invisible majority of sufferers. In medical reports, they were described with a peculiar blend of pity and disapproval. "These are not the coarse and degraded," wrote one physician in 1892, "but the delicate and refined, undone by their own sensibilities." It was the same double standard that had created their addiction in the first place. The cultural tide began to shift, not from compassion, but from fear. As morphine and cocaine spread among the working classes and colonial troops, addiction ceased to be viewed as a private weakness. It became a social threat. The moralists of the early 20th century seized upon the image of the fallen addict as evidence of society's decay. Newspapers printed lurid stories of opium dens, borrowed from sensationalist accounts of London's East End. The focus moved from the suffering of the addicted to the moral hygiene of the nation. Once again, empathy was replaced by anxiety. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 marked Britain's first serious legal attempt to control narcotics. It required prescriptions for opiates and empowered police to monitor their distribution. By then, laudanum had already begun to fade from respectability. Doctors who had once prescribed it freely now feared professional disgrace. Pharmacies reformulated their products, removing or reducing opium content. Advertisements for soothing syrups disappeared, replaced by promises of natural tonics and non-narcotic sedatives. And yet, the transition was uneven. In rural towns and poor districts, old habits lingered. Small bottles continued to change hands quietly, often without prescription. The culture of self-medication proved harder to eradicate than the drugs themselves. Behind the scenes, another transformation was underway, the birth of pharmacology as a true science. The mysterious tinctures of the Victorian age gave way to laboratory compounds, measured and tested with growing precision. The messy empiricism of the chemist's shop evolved into industrial chemistry. Morphine's successor would be heroin, first synthesized by Bayer in 1898 and marketed as a non-addictive alternative. It was prescribed widely to treat coughs, bronchitis, and even morphine addiction itself. Within a decade, the same cycle of dependence began anew. The Victorian doctor's dilemma had merely changed its form, but something deeper had shifted as well. The moral authority of medicine, the trust that once insulated doctors from blame, was crumbling. The 20th century demanded evidence, not intuition, accountability, not benevolence. Medical journals began to re-examine the past, tracing the history of opium from ancient Mesopotamia to the British Empire's trade networks. They saw, at last, how addiction had been sustained not just by ignorance, but by power, economic, social, and colonial. Britain's global dominance had been built, in part, on the poppy. The same substance that soothed its citizens' nerves had enslaved millions in India and China. The moral contradictions were undeniable. In this sense, the addiction crisis was both domestic tragedy and imperial mirror. The Victorian doctor's blind faith in medicine reflected the empire's blind faith in its own righteousness. Both sought to heal and dominate in equal measure. There were, however, small moments of grace amidst the reckoning. A handful of physicians began to listen to their patients not as cases, but as voices. Letters published in the British Medical Journal from the 1890 seconds tell of women writing to their doctors with painful honesty. I have tried 3 times to stop my laudanum. I cannot bear the nights. It is not pleasure I seek, but peace. Without it, my thoughts will not rest. Please, sir, do not tell my husband. He would rather see me dead than weak. These letters were rarely answered, but they mark the beginning of a new understanding that addiction was not a moral flaw, but a form of suffering. In asylums and reform homes, doctors continued to experiment with cures. Some used gradual tapering, reducing doses drop by drop. Others combined hypnosis, isolation, and religious instruction. A few even prescribed brandy as a substitute for opium, trading one dependency for another. Most of these treatments failed, but they reflected a growing awareness that the body remembered what the mind wished to forget. By the early 20th century, the language of addiction began to shift again from sin to sickness, and eventually to science. Imagine now the same hospital ward where the laudanum patient once trembled through withdrawal. It is 1910. The nurse still wears a starched apron, but the instruments are cleaner, the air less oppressive. On the bedside table rests a small glass bottle, not of laudanum, but of aspirin. The patient, older now, lies still. Her body has endured the worst of the storm. Her hands no longer shake. She looks out the window at the pale winter sun and wonders how many years she lost to the bottle that once promised rest. No one will remember her name. Her story will fade into the quiet anonymity of millions like her. But in that silence lies the legacy of the Victorian cure, the price of relief. When historians look back on the age of morphine and misery, they do not see villains and victims so much as systems. Systems of medicine built on trust without understanding. Systems of commerce built on need without conscience. Systems of gender and class that decided whose pain deserved attention and whose did not. The Victorian doctor's dilemma was never simply about drugs. It was about the dangerous intimacy between care and control. In their pursuit of healing, physicians discovered something unsettling, that to relieve pain is to wield power, and power, once granted, is not easily surrendered. As the 20th century dawned, Britain's pharmacies no longer glowed with amber bottles of laudanum. The shelves gleamed with aspirin tins, tonics, and powders stamped non-opiate in proud black letters. But the hunger for relief, the yearning for something to dull the ache of living, remained. Every age invents its own way of forgetting. And so, the story ends not with a cure, but with a question. What happens when the tools we trust most to heal us also teach us to depend on them? And can a society built on relief ever truly face its own pain? If you close your eyes, you can almost smell it, the faint, sweet scent of poppy resin drying under the Bengal sun. A field stretches to the horizon, pale green pods swaying in the heat. Men and women move slowly between the rows, their hands stained brown with sticky latex. This is not a farm. It is a factory without walls. The year is 1839, and the British Empire is harvesting addiction. Opium, once the humble medicine of apothecaries and poets, has become a weapon of empire. The same drug that soothed the nerves of Victorian mothers and calmed crying infants now finances the world's mightiest colonial machine. In the Indian province of Bihar, the East India Company oversees hundreds of thousands of acres of poppy cultivation. The farmers' ryots, as they are called, do not own their land, their crop, or their freedom to choose either. Each year, they are compelled by contract to sow poppy seeds instead of grain. The company supplies the seeds and the tools. The farmers supply the labor. When harvest comes, the resin is scraped from the pods, packed into balls, and delivered to company warehouses. There, inspectors measure its purity with metal rods, pressing deep into the brown gum to judge its quality. Payment comes in the form of debt. The riot receives a small advance before planting barely enough to survive, and at harvest, the company deducts costs for seed, transport, and inspection fees. Most farmers end the season poorer than they began. But there is no escape. The next year brings another advance, another contract, another crop of poppies. This is how empire grows, not from conquest alone, but from the quiet coercion of necessity. In Calcutta, the harvested resin is kneaded into cakes, dried in the sun, and stamped with the seal of the East India Company. The finished product is packed into teak chests, each containing 40 pounds of opium. From there, ships carry it down the Hooghly River and across the Bay of Bengal to Canton, modern-day Guangzhou. The Chinese government has long outlawed opium importation, but prohibition is no match for profit. Smugglers, brokers, and British traders collaborate to keep the trade alive. Each chest sells for a small fortune. The profits flow back to London. lubricating the machinery of empire. The irony is staggering. Britain, a nation that prides itself on morality and temperance, has become the world's largest dealer of narcotics. To understand how this came to be, you must look back to the peculiar economics of empire. The East India Company faced a dilemma in the late 18th century. Britain's appetite for Chinese tea was insatiable, but China demanded payment in silver, not goods. The empire was bleeding bullion. The solution, as conceived by the company's directors, was brutally simple. They would sell something China wanted, but officially forbade opium. The profits from smuggling would balance the trade deficit and fund the colonial administration in India. In effect, the empire financed its civility at home with addiction abroad. In the opium godowns of Patna, laborers work in silence, pressing the brown paste into molds. Each motion is practiced, almost reverent. The product is sacred, not for its healing properties, but for its profitability. At the docks of Calcutta, the scent of poppy resin mingles with the smell of salt and coal. Boxes are hoisted aboard East Indiamen, bound for southern China. Sailors watch them disappear into the hold, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that each chest carries not just narcotics, but history's most calculated hypocrisy. By the time these ships reach the Pearl River Delta, the network of smuggling is well established. British merchants anchor their vessels at Lintin Island, beyond Chinese jurisdiction. Local traders ferry the opium inland in small boats under cover of night. The profits are astronomical. In 1820, the British exported 4,000 chests of opium to China. By 1838, that number exceeded 40,000. The effects were catastrophic. Addiction spread across social classes, from soldiers to scholars, peasants to bureaucrats. The Qing government, alarmed by the social and economic toll, issued edicts banning the drug and punishing smugglers by death. But the profits were too vast to stop, and the empire too proud to yield. Enter Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner tasked with eradicating the opium trade. In 1839, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her sense of justice. "We have heard that you strictly prohibit opium within your own land. Why then do you allow it to be sold abroad and bring harm to other nations?" The letter went unanswered. Lin seized 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Canton and destroyed them in a dramatic public display. The British response was not negotiation, but war. The First Opium War, 1839, 1842, was not fought over morality, but money. The British government framed it as a defence of free trade and the rights of British subjects abroad. In truth, it was a campaign to protect the profits of an illegal drug trade. British gunboats shelled coastal forts and blockaded ports. The Qing army, ill-equipped and outmatched, fell quickly. When the smoke cleared, the Treaty of Nanking forced China to open its ports to British trade, pay heavy reparations, and cede Hong Kong. It was, in every sense, a war of addiction fought to preserve the right to sell suffering. At home, the British public was largely unaware of the true nature of the conflict. The opium trade was cloaked in euphemisms, commerce, tonics, medicinals. Newspapers framed the war as a triumph of civilization over Oriental despotism. Only a few dissenting voices saw through the hypocrisy. The missionary Charles Gutzlaff called it a war against humanity. The poet Thomas de Quincey, himself a laudanum addict, wrote bitterly of the poppy that blooms alike in England's parlours, China's prisons. But their words were drowned out by the roar of empire's progress. Meanwhile, in Bengal, the fields kept blooming. Each season, more land was devoted to poppy cultivation. The company's inspectors patrolled villages, enforcing contracts with quiet brutality. Any farmer who resisted risked losing his land, or worse, his life. Famine stalked the countryside. Grain fields lay fallow while poppies flourished. In years of drought, entire districts starved, their soil rich with opium but barren of food. Yet the ledgers in London showed profit. And profit, in the logic of empire, justified everything. The paradox deepened. British doctors prescribed opium to heal their patients, while British merchants sold it abroad to enslave another nation's body and mind. The same moral blindness that ruled the doctor's surgery now ruled the empire. Pain was both commodity and currency. By the mid-19th century, opium had become the invisible backbone of British finance. The trade funded railways, colonial administrations, and even parts of the Royal Navy. It linked the drawing rooms of London to the fields of Bihar and the alleys of Canton. A world economy of pain. There is an eerie quiet to this kind of history, the silence of systems operating exactly as designed. The farmers plant, the inspectors count, the merchants trade, the doctors prescribe. Each believes they are only doing their part. But beneath it all, the hum of dependency grows louder, economic, physical, moral. The empire has built its fortune on a drug it dares not name. By 1858, the East India Company was dissolved after the Indian Rebellion, and its territories were absorbed by the British Crown. Yet the opium system continued, unchanged. The colonial government in Calcutta took over the trade directly, claiming it as a state monopoly. In official reports, opium revenues were listed blandly under miscellaneous receipts. Behind those two words lay millions of scar, ruined lives. The empire, it seemed, could not wean itself from its own addiction. If you walk through the ruins of a colonial opium factory today, Patna, Ghazipur, or Benares, you might still smell the faint, sweet trace of poppy resin in the walls. The rooms are empty now. The press is silent. But the ghosts remain. The farmers who laboured in debt, the sailors who carried the cargo, the addicts who smoked in forgotten alleyways. This was the true geography of the Victorian drug crisis, stretching from English drawing rooms to Indian fields, from the doctor's hand to the empire's heart. And as the century advanced, a question began to echo in both medicine and politics alike. How long can an empire survive when its wealth depends on the suffering it denies? You are sitting in a London parlour in 1862. The fire crackles softly in the grate. The wallpaper is a floral print. The tea is cooling, and the air smells faintly of violets and varnish. On the table, beside the biscuits and the sewing basket, lies a small brown bottle with a paper label. Batley's sedative solution. Dose, 10 to 20 drops, as required. Inside is tincture of opium laudanum. It is perfectly legal, perfectly respectable, and it is everywhere. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain's global opium trade had come full circle. What began as an imperial export had seeped quietly back into the homes that profited from it. The empire's great narcotic enterprise was not only fueling wars abroad, it was soothing the nerves of mothers, clerks, and ministers. At home, opium, in one form or another, became the invisible companion of daily life. A drop in your tea for a toothache, a spoonful for the baby's colic, a tincture to calm nervous afflictions and female hysteria. The Victorians, so proud of their self-restraint, were quietly medicating their anxieties with the same drug that had torn apart empires. In pharmacies from Glasgow to Devon, rows of glass bottles lined the shelves. Laudanum, Dover's powder, Godfrey's cordial, Mother Bailey's quieting syrup. Each was an opium mixture, sold over the counter without prescription. The customers were not addicts in the modern sense. They were ordinary people seeking relief from the ordinary pain of industrial life. The weaver with chronic cough, the factory girl with menstrual cramps, the mother grieving the loss of another infant. Opium promised peace, and peace, in a world of noise and smoke, was irresistible. Doctors prescribed it liberally, often without understanding its dangers. To them, it was the one drug that seemed to cure everything. It dulled pain, stopped diarrhea, calmed anxiety, eased sleeplessness, and, perhaps most importantly, made patients compliant. Medical journals of the time are filled with casual endorsements. A Dr. Graves of Dublin once wrote that opium renders the patient indifferent to discomfort and the physician to despair. The phrase, it is telling. Opium was not just a medicine, it was a social lubricant between suffering and society. In the working-class neighborhoods of industrial cities, the drug became an unspoken part of survival. Laudanum was cheaper than bread. A penny bought enough to silence a crying child through the night. For the poor, it was both food and escape. Child mortality records from Manchester and Leeds show a grim pattern. Infants found lifeless in the cradle, their mothers admitting to giving them a dose of Godfrey's cordial. Coroners often ruled such cases accidental, calling them overlaying or natural causes. No one wanted to prosecute a mother for trying to survive poverty. In polite society, the addiction took a different form, quieter, more genteel. Middle-class women used opium for female troubles, a euphemism that covered everything from menstrual pain to depression. It dulled the mind as effectively as it dulled the body, transforming anxiety into a tranquil, fog-like calm. One medical writer noted with mild concern that ladies of refinement may acquire a dependence on their sedatives without suspecting the same. In reality, whole generations of women lived in a chemical twilight, too decorous to drink gin, too restrained to cry, too weary to stop dosing themselves. They were the empire's invisible patients, the domestic side of the opium economy. The literature of the age mirrored this relationship between comfort and decay. Writers like Thomas de Quincey, who famously chronicled his dependence in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, turned addiction into both a moral and a mystical experience. De Quincey described laudanum's effects in language that oscillated between horror and reverence. Oh, just, subtle. Thou hast the keys of paradise. Oh, just, subtle, and mighty opium. For De Quincey, opium was both a door to transcendence and a descent into despair. He was not alone. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote, Kubla Khan, under its influence. His vision of caverns measureless to man, reflecting both the vastness and the emptiness of opium's dream world. Victorian England was a society of paradoxes, public sobriety and private intoxication, moral sermonizing and chemical escape. The medical journals began to notice the contradictions. Reports emerged of the opium habit among respectable patients, people who could not sleep without it, who could not work without it, who suffered tremors, sweating, and hallucinations when they tried to stop. But physicians were slow to admit that the drug they prescribed so freely might itself be the cause of so many ills. Addiction, as a concept, hardly existed. It was not yet seen as a disease, but as a moral weakness, a failure of will. So the cycle continued. Pain, prescription, dependence, withdrawal, more pain, and across the sea, in India and China, the empire's supply lines ensured that the tame, brown powder never ran out. If the Victorian home was one face of the empire's opium trade, the colonial factory was its heart. In the 1,860 seconds, the British-controlled opium works at Ghazipur produced nearly 1,000 tons of refined opium annually. The process was almost ritualistic. The raw gum was softened with water, kneaded by hand, strained through cloth, and slowly evaporated in iron pans. The final product was rolled into bricks, stamped with official marks, and sealed in chests for export. It was a state monopoly, administered with bureaucratic precision. Every chest, every ounce, was accounted for. The annual opium revenue reports read like accounting ledgers, yet behind their bland numbers lay an empire's moral disfigurement. Gross receipts: Bengal opium, 6,372,000 rupees. Expenditure, including cost of cultivation and excise, 1,921,000 rupees. Net profit to the Government of India, 4,451,000 rupees. A quiet fortune, made from the harvest of human craving. Not everyone accepted this silence. A few reformers, missionaries, journalists, and politicians began to expose the contradiction between Britain's moral self-image and its narcotic empire. One of the most persistent voices was that of Reverend Frederick Storrs Turner, who founded the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade in 1874. Turner and his colleagues flooded Parliament with pamphlets, testimonies, and statistics, arguing that Britain's opium policy was a sin against God and man. They called it a war of poison against the East. But most of Parliament shrugged. The revenue was too valuable. The moral cost, too abstract. The irony deepened with the rise of morphine. In the 1820 seconds, German chemists had isolated the active alkaloid from opium and named it after Morpheus, the god of dreams. Morphine was hailed as a scientific breakthrough, a purified, rational version of opium, stripped of superstition and excess. By the 1850 seconds, it was widely used in British medicine, particularly after the invention of the hypodermic syringe. Doctors could now inject morphine directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the stomach and delivering instant relief. They believed, mistakenly, that this method reduced the risk of addiction. It did the opposite. The empire of opium had given birth to the empire of the needle. Soldiers returning from the Crimean War, treated with morphine for pain and shock, came home with invisible wounds, dependence, tremors, sleeplessness, melancholia. Doctors called it morphia habit. Once again, the line between medicine and vice blurred. The empire that preached self-control had engineered dependency with scientific precision. The newspapers, when they mentioned it at all, spoke of nervous complaints. The phrase covered everything from exhaustion to despair, symptoms not of individual weakness, but of an industrial, imperial age built on relentless pressure. The British world was running on stimulants and sedatives. Tea to wake up, tobacco to focus, alcohol to loosen, opium to forget. As the 19th century wore on, the British conscience began to stir. The idea that empire could be both moral and profitable was starting to crack. Missionaries in China sent home reports of ruined lives and social collapse. Philanthropists in London visited the slums and found laudanum bottles beside the empty milk tins. The rhetoric of empire, the belief that Britain was a civilizing force, was harder to maintain when the civilized were poisoning themselves and others alike. Yet the economic dependence on the drug was profound. Without the opium revenues, the British Raj would have collapsed under its own weight. Without the trade with China, Britain's balance of payments would have tipped into crisis. The gentle poison had become the invisible thread, holding together a global system. There's something haunting about this symmetry. In the drawing rooms of London, respectable women sipped laudanum for their nerves. In the fields of Bihar, Indian farmers bled the same poppies that fed those nerves. In the tea houses of Canton, Chinese smokers inhaled the residue of an empire's moral blindness. Three worlds, bound by a single plant. No one thought of it as a conspiracy. It was merely the logic of the age. Profit was progress. Comfort was virtue. Pain was a private matter, to be silenced rather than understood. And so, as the century drew toward its close, Britain found itself trapped in a paradox of its own making. The empire that prided itself on enlightenment was addicted to the dark. The society that measured morality in moderation was living in quiet chemical excess. No one yet called it a crisis, but the cracks were forming in medicine, in trade, in conscience. The question was not whether the empire could sustain its power, but whether it could sustain its self-deception. The end of an empire rarely arrives with a bang. Sometimes it fades out like the last embers of a fire, burning quietly into ash, while everyone pretends the warmth will last forever. For the British Opium Empire, that slow extinguishing began in the final decades of the 19th century. The poppy fields still bloomed in Bihar and Bengal, and the chests still left Calcutta for China. But the moral landscape was shifting. The same public that once sipped laudanum with tea now looked uneasily at the dark economics behind its comfort. The problem was no longer hidden. It had simply grown too large to ignore. In 1893, the British Parliament established the Royal Commission on Opium to investigate the trade's ethics and consequences. It was a strange affair. From the start, part investigation, part defence. The British government, unwilling to lose a source of vast revenue, packed the commission with officials sympathetic to the colonial system. The inquiry travelled through India, interviewing farmers, traders, and doctors. The results were predictable. The final report declared that the opium trade was not inconsistent with morality or humanity. It claimed that most Indians used the drug moderately, that addiction was rare, and that the revenue was essential for the maintenance of orderly government. In short, the empire declared itself innocent, but history has a way of ignoring official verdicts. While Parliament congratulated itself, new winds were blowing across the world. In China, reformers and revolutionaries were uniting against the humiliations of the past half-century unequal treaties, foreign concessions, and the moral decay wrought by opium. In 1906, the Qing dynasty, in one of its last acts before collapse, launched a nationwide campaign to eradicate opium cultivation and consumption. It was the first modern anti-drug policy on a global scale, and, astonishingly, it worked at least for a time. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of acres of poppy fields were destroyed, addicts were treated or punished, and the drug trade plummeted. China was finally confronting the ghost that Britain had left behind. But the British response was hesitant, almost defensive. The Indian colonial administration feared economic collapse if opium exports ceased. At the same time, British reformers, emboldened by public outrage, demanded an end to the trade. It was a moral tug-of-war between profit and conscience. By 1908, Britain and China signed an agreement to phase out the opium trade within 10 years. The Indian government promised to reduce cultivation annually, while China pledged to suppress domestic production. It was, at last, the beginning of withdrawal, not of individuals, but of empires. Yet even this retreat was tangled in hypocrisy. While India slowly reduced its exports, British companies continued to manufacture morphine and other opium derivatives for medical use, much of which found its way into the same markets under new labels. The substance changed names, not nature. In the parlours of London and Manchester, meanwhile, the laudanum bottles were disappearing. New laws like the Pharmacy Act of 1868 and later the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 restricted access to opium and morphine. For the first time, addiction became a matter of public health, not private morality. But for many Victorians, the damage was done. Doctors recorded cases of lifelong dependence, patients unable to sleep or eat without morphine, their nerves shattered, their hands trembling with ghostly memory. Some tried to taper off, measuring their doses with obsessive precision. Others replaced one addiction with another: alcohol, chloral hydrate, barbiturates. The human body, once conditioned to chemical peace, does not surrender easily. In India, the story ended more quietly, but more tragically. When the opium system was finally dismantled after World War I, millions of farmers were left without income. The colonial administration had never built a viable agricultural alternative. The soil, exhausted by decades of poppy cultivation, could no longer sustain grain crops. In some districts, famine followed. The empire had spent a century teaching farmers to grow pain instead of food. And when that pain was no longer profitable, it simply walked away. The same ships that once carried opium now carried soldiers, uniforms, and coal. The poppy had outlived its imperial purpose. In China, the withdrawal was more violent. When the Qing dynasty fell in 1911, regional warlords quickly revived the opium trade to fund their armies. By the 1922, the drug was once again flooding the countryside, this time under the control of local militarists and criminal syndicates. It was no longer a British monopoly, but the damage was already woven into the nation's veins. In a grim twist of history, opium, once a symbol of humiliation under foreign powers, became a weapon of internal division. The smoke dens returned, the addiction deepened, and the promise of reform dissolved into chaos. Every empire leaves behind its ghosts. This was Britain's. At home, the ghost took a subtler form. The moral panic of the early 20th century about drugs, degeneration, and racial decay owed much to the uneasy memory of Britain's narcotic past. The very nation that had once justified war to defend the opium trade now recast itself as the guardian of global sobriety. In 1912, Britain was among the leading powers to sign the International Opium Convention, the first global drug control treaty. It was a remarkable act of moral reinvention. The empire that had built its wealth on addiction now sought to police it. But morality, like history, is rarely tidy. By the time of the First World War, morphine had become indispensable to modern medicine. Field hospitals relied on it to dull the agony of industrial warfare, gas burns, amputations, shrapnel wounds. Doctors who administered the drug to the wounded knew its dangers but had no alternative. Pain and morphine were now bound together by necessity, as they had always been by profit. The soldiers who returned home carried not just physical scars, but chemical ones. Many quietly continued to use morphine after the war. Society called them morphinists, but seldom offered help. Addiction remained a private shame, even as it spread across a generation that had seen too much and felt too much. If you trace the story far enough, you can see the strange symmetry between the empire's rise and its unraveling. In the 18th century, opium was the key to Britain's global dominance, balancing its trade, funding its colonies, underwriting its industrial wealth. By the 20th, it had become a symbol of decline, hypocrisy, and moral reckoning. Empires, like addicts, often destroy themselves in pursuit of control. Even today, the echoes remain. The pharmaceutical crisis of the modern world, the misuse of prescription opioids, the marketing of pain relief as progress follows an old and familiar pattern. The names have changed. Laudanum has become oxycodone. Morphine has become fentanyl. But the logic endures. The promise of comfort, the profit independence, the silence that follows. We like to think of the Victorians as distant, buttoned, moralizing, prudish, but their struggles are our own. The belief that pain must always be eliminated, that discomfort is a failure, that commerce and compassion can coexist without contradiction. History, it seems, is not just the story of wars and kings, but of the quiet bargains we make with suffering. If you visit the Ghazipur opium factory today, still operating, still producing medical opiates under the government of India, you will see the same process that began 2 centuries ago. Men in white uniforms stir vats of brown paste. The air smells faintly sweet, almost floral. It is all perfectly legal, perfectly regulated, perfectly modern, and yet, somewhere in that smell, lingers the memory of the empire's long addiction of poppies in the sun, of mothers with trembling hands, of doctors measuring doses by lamplight. History does not end. It only metabolizes. And so, as the 20th century dawned, Britain faced the final question its empire had postponed for 100 years. When a nation builds its power on the promise of relief from pain, what happens when the relief runs out? Imagine a London street in 1871. The gas lamps have just been lit. The air smells faintly of soot, horse, sweat, and rain. You walk past the chemist's shop. The window gleams with glass bottles and Latin labels: tinctura, opii, chlorodyne, morphia, sulfurs. Inside, a man in a starched collar measures brown liquid into tiny glass vials. The pharmacist's movements are steady, almost ritualistic. The exchange is brief. A coin, a nod, a bottle. No questions asked. This is not an act of vice. It is medicine. And medicine, in Victorian Britain, was learning to measure mercy by the drop. The 19th century was an age of medical paradox. Never before had physicians known so much and understood so little. They could amputate a limb, drain a wound, or deliver a baby in a cramped tenement room. But they could not stop infection, halt fever, or ease chronic pain without the one miracle substance they trusted above all: opium. To be a doctor in this era was to live in the shadow of suffering. Pain was constant, visible, unavoidable. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics beyond ether and chloroform, and no reliable treatments for diseases that filled the city's graveyards: tuberculosis, cholera, typhus. Opium was the only weapon they had that worked quickly, predictably, and mercifully. In 1847, the surgeon Robert Liston performed one of the first public operations using chloroform as anesthesia. It was a triumph. But even after the discovery of surgical anesthetics, opium remained indispensable, not only for surgery, but for everything that followed. After amputation, patients were dosed with laudanum to suppress agony. After childbirth, mothers were given morphine to rest. After sleepless nights, the weary were prescribed chlorodyne, a mixture of opium, chloroform, and alcohol marketed as a cure for every human ill. Each dose dulled the edges of life, making both doctor and patient believe that healing had occurred. Victorian doctors were not villains. They were, in many ways, desperate humanists. They had sworn to relieve pain, and opium allowed them to do so beautifully, effectively. In a time before germ theory was fully accepted, before laboratory medicine existed, comfort was often the only measure of success. Patients judged a doctor's worth by how much pain he could make disappear, and doctors judged themselves by how often their patients stopped screaming. To understand how deeply this belief ran, you must step inside a Victorian hospital ward. The floorboards creak under your shoes. The air is thick with carbolic acid and despair. Dozens of beds line the room, each occupied by the pale, sweating body of a patient. In one corner, a man with gangrene moans softly. In another, a woman with tuberculosis coughs until she bleeds. A nurse moves quietly from bed to bed, spooning brown syrup between trembling lips. She wipes mouths, adjusts pillows, and murmurs words of comfort that no one really hears. The bottle she carries, its label faded, is tincture of opium. Pain relief was the highest form of compassion a hospital could offer. Cure was often beyond reach. It is easy to forget how ordinary pain was in this world. A toothache could last for weeks. A broken bone meant months of immobility. Childbirth was perilous, and minor infections could become mortal. The Victorians lived closer to the threshold of suffering than we can easily imagine. They endured it as a matter of course. And yet, when a substance appeared that could silence pain completely, they embraced it without hesitation. It was a revolution of mercy, quiet, chemical, and profound. By the 1850 seconds, the medical profession had institutionalized opium's use. Textbooks listed precise doses for every age, ailment, and temperament. Doctor, Jonathan Pereira's Elements of Materia Medica recommended laudanum for neuralgias, spasmodic coughs, hysteria, dysentery, and the miseries of sleeplessness. The drug's reach was universal, from the factory worker's injury to the bishop's melancholy. Physicians began to describe opium as the divine gift, a substance that bridged the gap between human suffering and divine compassion. But the problem was not that it worked too little, it was that it worked too well. Once a patient had tasted the piece of opium, other medicines seemed cruel by comparison. Doctors found themselves prescribing larger and more frequent doses not to cure, but to comfort. The boundaries between treatment and indulgence blurred. A medical case report from 1869 describes a woman, long confined to bed with nervous disorder, whose laudanum habit rose from 20 drops daily to over 2 ounces. Her physician noted the addiction, but admitted, without it, she cannot live in tolerable comfort. For many doctors, this was justification enough. The moral question whether pain should sometimes be endured rather than erased rarely surfaced in medical journals. Pain was not seen as meaningful, only inconvenient. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet unease was growing. Some physicians began to notice that the patients they helped most were also those they could never cure. Dr. Edward Tilt, a specialist in female diseases, confessed in 1873, "Opium is both my ally and my enemy. It relieves, and in relieving, it ensnares. It spares the nerves only to enslave them." This was the doctor's dilemma, to choose between comfort and cure, between mercy and honesty. Dilemma extended far beyond medicine. It reflected an entire society that preferred the illusion of stability over the confrontation with pain. In the 1860 seconds, the chemist John Collis Brown marketed his invention chlorodyne as a universal remedy for everything from diarrhea to despair. Advertisements promised instant relief and perfect repose. The ingredients were opium, chloroform, and treacle. It was sold in every chemist's shop, shipped to every colony, and consumed by every class. One London journalist called it the liquid sleep of the age. And indeed, Victorian Britain was drifting through a kind of waking dream, sedated, soothed, and unable to imagine medicine without opium. There were early warnings. In 1868, the Pharmacy Act restricted the sale of opium preparations to licensed chemists, requiring that poisons be labelled and recorded. But enforcement was weak, and demand was insatiable. Pharmacists quietly continued to sell soothing syrups and cough elixirs under gentler names. The public trusted them, as they trusted the doctors implicitly. When deaths occurred, coroners often described them as accidental. Addiction was a word reserved for gin drinkers, not respectable patients. It would take another generation before medicine recognized that its greatest tool was also its most seductive trap. And yet, even among those who saw the dangers, the moral arithmetic remained the same. The doctor's duty was to relieve pain. If that required dependency, so be it. After all, pain was the greater evil. This conviction was particularly strong among physicians treating women, whose suffering was often dismissed as nervous or emotional. The solution was nearly always sedation. A woman in distress was given laudanum, morphine, or bromides. The calm that followed was interpreted as recovery. But what had really been cured? The pain or the person? As medicine professionalized toward the end of the century, a new generation of doctors began to question the old faith in opium. Advances in pathology and bacteriology were transforming medicine from an art of comfort into a science of cause. Yet the habits of the past lingered. Many older practitioners resisted change, insisting that no better friend to humanity existed than the poppy. The debate between comfort and cure became a defining tension in Victorian medicine, and in some ways, it still is. One striking episode captures this transition. In 1885, during a cholera outbreak in Calcutta, British medical officers debated the best treatment. Traditional practice called for opium to calm the spasms, but a new generation of doctors argued for rehydration and sanitation instead. The older men scoffed. "You cannot cure with water what only God can soothe," one said. And yet, the younger doctors were right. Cholera was not divine punishment, it was bacterial. Opium did nothing but numb the dying. The age of the gentle poison was nearing its end, but not its influence. To look back at this moment is to see the birth of a modern paradox. We still expect medicine to make us comfortable. We still judge its success by how little we feel. The Victorians taught us that lesson with sincerity and with terrible cost. Their doctors believed in mercy, not money. But mercy, unchecked, became dependency. Comfort became commerce. And the empire that built its medical authority on compassion found itself unable to tell the difference between healing and escape. As night falls on that imagined London street, the chemist shutters his shop. The glass bottles gleam in the lamplight rows of quiet power, waiting for tomorrow's pain. A mother will come for her child's cough. A clerk will come for his insomnia. A doctor will come for his own exhaustion. Each will take comfort home in a bottle. Each will sleep a little easier. And somewhere, in the calm between doses, a question will begin to stir, unspoken, uneasy. If medicine's first duty is to relieve pain, what happens when pain is the only thing that tells us we are still alive? If you were a doctor in 1875, you carried two things with you, wherever you went: your stethoscope and your bottle of laudanum. The stethoscope made you a man of science. The laudanum made you human. To relieve pain was, after all, to play God. If only for a moment, and no substance allowed you to perform that small miracle, as swiftly or as convincingly as opium. The physician's black bag was a sacred object in Victorian England. Inside, alongside scissors and scalpels, were small corked bottles filled with powders and tinctures of the poppy, morphine, codeine, and laudanum, each a different refinement of the same ancient plant, cultivated for centuries from the fields of Anatolia to the ports of Bristol. To the untrained eye, these bottles looked identical. To the trained hand, they represented the difference between quiet sleep and permanent silence. Yet even the most cautious doctors used them daily. The alternative was to let their patients scream. Medical journals of the period reveal the astonishing range of conditions treated with opiates. The Lancet in 1869 recommended morphine injections for rheumatism, bronchitis, neuralgia, gout, and domestic hysterias. The British Medical Journal called it the only constant companion of the physician. In an era before antibiotics, morphine was used less as a cure than as a curtain to draw over the suffering until nature or death intervened. The moral arithmetic was simple. If a person was doomed to pain, then to dull that pain was mercy, not error. But slowly, the arithmetic began to shift. Doctors began to notice patterns they could not ignore. Patients would recover from illness, but remain dependent on the drug. Requests for repeat prescriptions multiplied, and when doses were withheld, symptoms of distress returned not from the disease, but from the absence of the medicine itself. Still, most physicians refused to call it addiction. They called it habit. One medical textbook delicately described a laudanum habitué as a patient who derives comfort and serenity from regular medicinal use. The language softened the truth. Comfort and serenity were symptoms, not signs of health. The emergence of the hypodermic syringe in the 1,850 seconds changed everything. What had once been swallowed or sipped could now be injected directly into the bloodstream. It was clean, precise. The hypodermic needle transformed morphine from a gentle sedative into a near-instant elixir of relief. It also introduced a new class of patients, those addicted not by accident, but by treatment. One of the first to note the danger was Dr. Francis Anstey, editor of the Practitioner Journal. In 1869, he warned that the habitual use of morphia injections for chronic disease is apt to enslave the very will of the sufferer. But even Anstey could not abandon the drug entirely. He ended the same article with a confession. For all its dangers, I know no remedy so noble in its action. By the 1,870 seconds, morphine addiction among physicians themselves had become a quiet epidemic. The long hours, the constant exposure to human misery, and the easy access to narcotics formed a perfect trap. Medical memoirs from the period reveal the silent suffering of the healers. One doctor wrote, "We treat pain with opium, and we treat the despair of seeing too much pain with the same." To numb oneself was not indulgence, it was survival. In hospital wards and private surgeries alike, the poppy ruled. Let us step into one such surgery. The year is 1876. The doctor's office smells of camphor, leather, and damp paper. Bottles line the shelves: belladonna, quinine, ether, morphine. A young woman sits across from the physician, pale and trembling. Her complaint: nervous exhaustion, a phrase broad enough to mean anything from grief to malnutrition. He listens, nods gravely, and reaches for his pen. His handwriting is slow and deliberate. Ah, tinctura, opii, 20 drops at bedtime. Repeat as needed for calm. He tears the slip from his pad and hands it across the desk. The prescription is both a comfort and a sentence. In a few weeks, she will return calmer, more composed, and strangely dependent on his care. Doctors justified their choices with logic that sounded compassionate. Pain is an evil. Opium relieves pain. Therefore, opium is good. But within that syllogism hid an entire century's blindness to addiction, emotion, and poverty. The people most likely to receive opiates were women, the poor, and the chronically ill. The same groups least likely to question authority. Medical paternalism disguised dependency as treatment, and for many women, especially, opium became a quiet substitute for the freedoms society denied them. The case of Mrs. H, recorded in a London hospital in 1881, illustrates the tragedy. A mother of 4, suffering from nervous exhaustion and melancholia, she was prescribed morphine injections twice daily. Her doctor noted marked improvement after a week. By month's end, she was taking the injections herself. By the second month, she could not sleep without them. When the doctor tried to taper her dose, she experienced violent fits, tremors, and despair. He recorded her decline with clinical detachment. The patient shows great anxiety at the thought of discontinuing the morphia and begs that her injections may be restored. She died within the year of respiratory collapse. The cause listed: heart weakness. And yet, this was not scandalous. It was ordinary. The Victorians accepted such deaths as regrettable consequences of medical mercy. The physician's conscience remained largely untouched, shielded by the belief that he had at least eased the passage from pain to peace. To die comfortably was better than to live in torment. This idea that comfort is worth any cost was the cornerstone of Victorian medical ethics. It justified everything from laudanum for infants to morphine for the dying. But as the century waned, that ethical comfort began to fray. A new generation of doctors, influenced by science and social reform, began to view opium through a different lens. The German chemist Friedrich Serturner, who had first isolated morphine from opium in 1804, had warned that it was a terrible gift of the gods. His words, long ignored, began to sound prophetic. In Britain, physicians like Dr. Norman Kerr and Dr. George Hunter began writing opium